Roller coasters, as we know them today, could not exist without wood. Long before the idea of sending people over massive hills and through countless inversions, carpenters and craftsmen would use hills and terrain to propel people down a speeding drop. Later, this would evolve slowly, before inspired pioneers would build up structures with a wooden frame, before finally reaching the switchback railways and other primitive first attempts of what we acknowledge as roller coasters today. While this video won't cover the full history of every wooden coaster ever, as footage, documentation, and reference material for rides over 100 years old can be a bit of a challenge, this will be a small recap before the era of modern wooden coasters as we know now. Thankfully, the fantastic channel J Natty Boy has already posted a better comprehensive history of wooden coasters than I ever could, so I would definitely watch his series before finishing this. Really taking legitimate shape at the beginning of the 20th century, a handful of designers would shape the fully realized roller coaster landscape, most notably John A. Miller. More than layout design, his train innovations really stole the show, creating the anti-rollback system, the lap bar, and the modern wheel assembly, including upstop wheels, eliminating the danger of trains or riders coming off the track. In his time, Miller would design an astounding 156 coasters, featuring large out-and-back layouts, with 7 of these classics surviving today, and being the master over nearly all designers along and after him, including Frederick Church. Building far fewer coasters in his time, he specialized in more curved and banking layouts, navigated by his own individual car trains, both of which were very similar to what can be found on modern GCI coasters today. There would also be Harry G. Traver, a twisted man who pushed the limits back then with his Cyclone coasters, with violent, wild drops that would certainly not pass standards today, but enticed onlookers with the out-of-control, warped layouts. And then there's Herbert Paul Schmeck, coming along later as an apprentice to John A. Miller for Paragon Park's giant coaster in 1917, before later being appointed as the head designer for the carousel manufacturer Philadelphia Toboggan Company. Schmeck would transform PTC into the main manufacturer of the second real generation of wooden coasters, building rides for 30 years at his time with the company before his passing in 1954. His shoes would be filled by John C. Allen, helping navigate the company through a slower time post-World War II, as the entire amusement industry would see major declines and closures. He would still build plenty of rides for PTC, as well as National Amusement Devices, or NAD, staying strong through this third generation, before a new coaster at a new park would change the trajectory of not only roller coasters, but amusement parks forever. With a steady economy, the early 70s would see many parks open all around the United States, and not just small trolley parks seen in the past. Almost every major city around the country would be inspired by Walt Disney's massive success Disneyland to bring their own large-scale, ambitious parks to their own region. Some with larger plans than others, but all certainly drawing from pure Americana. With steel coasters still in their infancy outside of Arrow's mine trains and wooden coasters having fallen out of style, these parks mainly opened with transportation rides, flat rides, and various shows. This would all change with a new park out of Cincinnati, Ohio, rebuilding a local park named Coney Island, with the goal of harkening back to the traditional rides found at parks of old. Kings Island would open with 2 wooden coasters designed by John C. Allen, the first of which being Scooby-Doo, a modified version of his first Jet Flyer layout used 3 times before, with a small compact figure 8 layout. The other would not just be any ordinary wooden coaster, but one that would reshape the entire amusement industry, the racer. Aside from Arrow's first coaster, the Matterhorn bobsleds, this would be the first large-scale coaster with 2 tracks in over 30 years, with 2 identical mirrored layouts side by side. Not only that, the massive white structure would take the title of the longest total track of any operating coaster out there, as well as being one of the tallest and fastest. This patriotic coaster would send a red and blue train from either side, and turn into parallel lifts that would have a straight drop into multiple camelback hills, before turning away from each other for a large flat turnaround and returning back alongside the original hills to complete the race. While not being the most mind-blowing design, the ride didn't need to be. It did just what it was trying to do, remind people of how fun and exciting wooden coasters could be, and it absolutely changed what guests were looking for at amusement parks. They needed bigger thrills, taller, longer, faster, and more wild, and that's just what they would get in the years to come. Just 1 year later, Six Flags Over Georgia, who like many parks just had a mine train and a mini one to its name, would respond to guest demands with a large wooden coaster of their own. Continuing the American pride taking over parks around the country, the Great American Scream Machine would outdo Racer in every stat, with a longer length than either individual side of the former. Again designed by John C. Allen, this time he would get help from 2 designers working on their first coaster, William Cobb and Don Rosser. Sporting another striking white, red, and blue color scheme, this coaster would be partially built over a scenic lake, dropping into an L-shaped layout with 3 large flat turnarounds and many rapid hills between. While not as respected as the Racer today, this star-spangled coaster would continue to build riders' demands in a different market for larger and better rides. With the industry moving towards larger coasters, this year would also see the last of 2 smaller models from industry staples PTC and NAD. Comet Jr. would be NAD's last model of the coaster's namesake, and Comet would be an even more patriotic, fully red, white, and blue coaster, also designed by John C. Allen, and would be PTC's last junior coaster model. Two years after Kings Island had opened as a smashing success, Taft Broadcasting would plan a sister park in Virginia with the name Kings Dominion. 1 year before the park would officially open, a preview would show guests what was to come, with the Lion Country Safari drive-through zoo and a small wooden coaster standing alone named Scooby-Doo, and be an identical layout to the coaster found at Kings Island. While 1974 would be a preview for the park, 1975 would see the park officially open with a variety of attractions and its true major headliner. Rebel Yell would be John C. Allen's next racing coaster, and while being shorter in height and length to the Racer, it would hit a higher top speed and feature a steeper drop. Nearly identical in design language to the Racer, this would feature another 2 parallel lifts and multiple hills, but with turnarounds that wouldn't go as far away from each other. Taft would also open a third and final Scooby-Doo coaster, this time at the new Carowinds in the Carolinas. After slowly growing over the past 5 years, 1976 would see the first big explosion of wooden coaster competition, with 4 coasters opening, all in different regions and from different designers. Starting right back at Carowinds, the park, like the other Taft parks, would get its own racing coaster named Thunder Road, but this time not designed by John C. Allen, but rather a first design from Curtis D. Summers. This layout would be nearly identical to Rebel Yell, but slightly larger and with the gimmick of being built over two state lines, so riders would travel from South to North Carolina and back. Next would be yet another opening day coaster at a park, this time High Roller at Valley Fair. Designed by the Minneapolis-based Roundhorse Corporation, this would not jump out statistically like the other coasters of this year or the past few, but instead be a very simple out and back layout, with a strong final hill and an elongated turn finale. While not opening day, Texas Cyclone would be the first coaster to open at Astroworld in Houston, and overseen as the only coaster from the Frontier Construction Company. At the time, the famous Coney Island Cyclone in New York was in danger of being removed, and initially Astroworld had plans to relocate the coaster to their park to preserve the icon. After the plans fell through, the park decided they still wanted the coaster, so they contacted William Cobb and Don Rosser to build their second coaster ever, and thus a mirror image of the famous coaster was built. Slightly beefed up with taller and longer stats, the very faithful remake would inspire many more parks to build their own version of this layout in the future. This wouldn't be the only coaster Bill and Don would work on this year, as they would help John C. Allen design his final coaster, and they would help him go out on a high note. Opening as the tallest and fastest wooden coaster in the world, the again patriotic Screamin' Eagle would open as the headline attraction at Six Flags Over Mid-America. Beginning up a 110-foot lift hill, the coaster would do a swooping turnaround before a 92-foot drop into a flurry of airtime hills on a hillside setting. Completing a very similar L-shaped layout to Great American Scream Machine, Screamin' Eagle would feature more breakneck pacing in a longer and more wooded layout. Besides High Roller, this year's coasters would all find themselves somewhere in the top 5s of height, length, and speed, and the additions from various designers would kick the door open for the future of wooden coasters, while seeing the last from the designer who kicked the new craze off. After taking a year off, America would see 3 new wooden coasters debut, all from different designers. Bill Cobb and Don Rosser, who worked alongside John C. Allen the past few years, would each have their own coasters, with the formers being Tornado at Iowa's Adventureland. The modest coaster would begin up a 93-foot lift and drop into a very large hill that would nearly stall out at the top, before a very simple out-and-back layout. Rosser's design would be known as the Florida Hurricane at Circus World, with a similar height to Tornado, but 500 more feet of track and a more fast-paced layout. Dropping into a low banking hill, the coaster would make its way up a giant turnaround, before another series of hills and a quick turnaround back into the station. The third of the year would make up for these smaller coasters though, as California's Magic Mountain, who had just made a big splash 2 years before with the world's first looping coaster, looked to go as big as possible. Colossus would nearly stand as the world's tallest coaster, beaten just weeks before by Cedar Point's Gemini by inches, and with a shorter drop than the Loch Ness Monster in the super competitive year of 1978. But still, it utterly dominated the other two in terms of track length, and would be the first modern wooden coaster to take the Triple Crown for height, length, and speed. The coaster would be the only product to come from International Amusement Devices, the new name for the former Titan National Amusement Devices, leading to an unconventional design to many of the other wooden coasters that had opened in the decade. Very similar to Gemini, this would be a departure from the other racing Woodies, with both sides running parallel the entire course, only diverging, exiting, and returning to the station. Climbing a massive 125-foot lift, both sides would drop into a massive turnaround, before a series of hills and 2 more turnarounds in between. While not the most innovative layout, Colossus would still be known around the world for its dominating appearance, popularized in film and television at the time, and set another standard in the growing landscape of wooden behemoths. The next year would see Bill Cobb and Don Rosser come back together for their first racing coaster, as the new largest coaster at Six Flags Great Adventure. Rolling Thunder would stand at a much more modest size compared to the racing giants that had opened before it, with similar stats to each of Cobb's and Rosser's coasters from the year before, but would feature a unique interacting layout not seen yet. Also running completely parallel similar to Colossus, these coasters would drop through hills of all kinds of sizes, with the left side running taller in the first half and shorter in the second, and the right side being the reverse with faster pacing. This fun interaction going above and below the train to the side would be a nice novelty, but would be quickly outshined by the other wooden coaster to open this year. After watching other parks outpace the racer through the decade, Kings Island was ready to remind the world who put wooden coasters back on the map. Cincinnati-based Al Collins and Jeff Gramke, who worked at the park, would be tasked to design the park's next coaster, and with the guidance from the retired John C. Allen, they would concoct the wooden coaster to end all wooden coasters. Built under the park's chief engineer, Charles Dinn, as well as structural engineer Curtis D. Summers, the coaster would travel through the natural terrain of the back of the park with a mess of cliffs and ravines, taking up 35 total acres and end up with an absurd 7,361 feet of track. A record that was not only unthinkable for the time, but has yet to be broken today. This monster of a project would appropriately open as the Beast, the new fastest wooden coaster as well, and while tied for physical height with Screamin' Eagle, the 141-foot drop would be the tallest plunge on a wooden coaster as well. Rolling out of the station and up the lift into the woods, riders would take that massive drop into a meandering layout, with long sections of straight track and a super elongated mid-course brake run. The coaster's supports would solemnly go above ground, carving into the hillside and even through tunnels, before a second lift. After slowly crawling around a turn at the top, the train would begin shallowly dropping and building up speed at an offset bank, before riders would be blasted into an absurdly large double helix, before finally crawling its way back to the station. Not only did the Beast set every new record for not just wooden, but steel coasters as well, it broke the mold of the classic layouts parks had been building over the last 10 years. Certainly no out and back, the thrill came from not knowing where you would go next, and that out-of-control sensation would be attempted by more parks in the future. Following such a massive coaster would be near impossible, but the original Six Flags Over Texas would throw their hat in the ring with Judge Roy's Scream. Named after a man who became a local legend, this would be the final collaboration between Don Rosser and Bill Cobb, and would easily be their smallest design. Interestingly located outside the park along the main entrance lake, the simple out and back would be as standard as possible, with simple hills going out and back, and a flat turnaround between. "1981 would see another new park opening, this time north of the border, an opening with not just one Woody, but 3. This would be Canada's Wonderland, Taft Broadcasting's 4th park, and with that, a familiar lineup, including a 4th small jet flyer layout with Scooby's gasping Ghoster Coaster. All of these coasters would be designed by Curtis D. Summers, with the two larger coasters being modeled after two former coasters from Cincinnati's Coney Island. The mighty Canadian Mindbuster would be a near mirror image of the Shooting Star, as the design was originally intended to be used at Kings Island instead of the Beast. Canada's Wonderland would pick up the design for this simple out-and-back layout and place it in their park, with a few strong hills on the outward leg before another series to return, before finishing off with a flat upward helix finale. The other, Wild Beast, would be modeled after Coney Island's Wildcat, featuring a more cyclone-style oval layout. Beginning with a steep first drop into a turnaround, the coaster would hop over two quick banking hills before a ferocious turnaround and a low-to-the-ground second half following the inside path of the first. There would be a fourth wooden coaster this year as well in America, as a final send-off to the giant patriotic racing coasters of the past decade. Also designed by Curtis D. Summers, this would be manufactured as the first large coaster from Swiss manufacturer Intamin, and the first custom layout to open at Marriott's Great America. This would be no small racer either, as the park would go all out for American Eagle, and including both tracks, this would dethrone the Beast as the new Triple Crown holder, surpassing both height and drop, as well as top speed. This massive coaster would climb two parallel 127-foot lifts, followed by a 147-foot drop into two quick hills, before rising into the ride's signature element. While the Beast had its infamous double helix, nothing compares to the massive dense structure of American Eagle, but what it made up for in size, it lacked in speed, slowly accelerating down the spiral before hitting a midcourse and splitting each layout separate from each other. The red side would drop into a longer series of hills, while blue would rise into a large hill before crossing over, before both would jump into another brake run and an extra helix finale. After a healthy series of larger and larger red, white, and blue racing woodies, American Eagle would be an excellent finale, and springboard Intamin into bigger and better projects years later. The next year, Taft would add another coaster with the Coney Island Wildcat layout, this time being the Grizzly at King's Dominion. Unlike Wild Beast, this would be located deep in the woods, creating a more unpredictable sensation similar to the Beast. "1983 would see our next coaster from Bill Cobb, this time the Riverside Cyclone at New England's Riverside Amusement Park. While in name and footprint, this would seem to be another Coney Island Cyclone layout, this would feature some key changes to make this a very different coaster. Beginning up a 112-foot lift, instead of dropping to ground level and into a tall turnaround, the coaster would drop into a short, tight turn on the lower turnaround, before a shallow dip into a high hill and turn. Off that turnaround would be the largest drop of the ride, falling to ground level and then into the taller part of the first drop, before then riding the inside of the structure and starting to follow the similar path of the original Cyclone layout. "1984 would be the last year with no new Woodies to open, and in 1985 they would return in full force with 4 new coasters. Taft Broadcasting would take their ventures overseas to Australia's Wonderland, and with that, they would stick to their bread and butter. The headliner Bush Beast would be yet another Coney Island Wildcat layout, and Beastie would be yet another Jetflyer layout, with both evoking the iconography of the Beast at Kings Island. While America was done with its giant racing woodies, Canada had one more up its sleeve, as Montreal's La Ronde would open Le Monster, another Bill Cobb creation. Taking the record for the new tallest coaster, this giant would take both tracks through a cyclone-style figure-8 layout, but while both ran parallel, the layouts would be entirely different. One would focus on shorter hills with faster pacing, while the other would have larger hills with more steep drops, but both would race through a massive elevated double helix with a variety of dips and banking before a similar side-by-side finale. After this massive monster of a coaster, the final of the year would be a smaller stature coaster opening at the small camping picnic grove Knoebels in Pennsylvania. While over the past few years, Pennsylvania and the rest of the country had seen countless classic wooden coasters close, Knoebels decided to take a risk and do something many did not know was possible and relocate a classic coaster. The Rocket had operated at San Antonio's Playland Park since 1940 and sat idle for 5 years before Knoebels decided to resurrect the coaster, and this idea of bringing a ride back from the dead led to a fitting name, the Phoenix. One of Herbert Paul Schmeck's later coasters, this had to be carefully disassembled and labeled due to the lack of blueprints, but the effort to bring this classic back paid off, and the coaster became a fan favorite. The simple figure-8 layout would begin with a tunnel before climbing a 78-foot lift and drop into a layout of nothing but turnarounds and airtime hills, headlined by a wild finale. The Phoenix would not only put Knoebels on the map for roller coaster fans, but it would also show parks that classic rides could be saved, and would start a new pattern the following years. "1986 would see a fourth and final Coney Island Wildcat layout open, also named Grizzly, but this time at the formerly owned Marriott's Great America in Santa Clara. Now under the ownership of Taft Broadcasting, they would add their favorite layout, this time a mirror version with slightly more tame profiling. Taking note of the success of the Phoenix, the recently opened Wild World in Maryland would relocate another wooden coaster, this time the far larger Giant Coaster from Paragon Park. Operating since 1917, this John A. Miller designed and later Herbert Schmeck redesigned coaster would be one of the top 5 tallest operating wooden coasters all the way up to 1980, and its relocation would be done under the supervision of Charles Dinn, who had recently left as head of engineering at Kings Island. The coaster would begin up a 98-foot lift and would charge down an 88-foot drop and over 2 fast-paced hills, before a turnaround and another barrage of hills before the finale. Originally destroyed in a 1963 fire, Curtis D. Summers would help restore a helix on the original coaster for a nice bit of variety to end the ride. One year later, yet another small Pennsylvania park would relocate a closed wooden coaster, this time Lakemont Park rebuilding the Skyliner from New York's Roseland Park. Originally opening in 1960 as one of John C. Allen's early coasters, this would begin up a lift of only 60 feet, turning into a steep drop before a simple L-shaped layout, following the shape and then running the same way inside before returning to the station. While wooden coasters had seen a huge second wind with the Racer, since American Eagle, all that had really been seen was remakes of classic layouts and now relocated coasters. Is this what their fate was to be? A nostalgic novelty ride for a more classic feel? Parks had been shifting to steel looping coasters from Arrow and Vekoma over the last 10 years, and with stagnation in design, it seemed like this could be as far as they could go. After helping build two of the best wooden coasters in the world, Charles Dinh would leave Kings Island in 1983 to begin his own firm. With the help of designer Curtis D. Summers, the two would help relocate the previously mentioned Phoenix and Wild One, but finally in 1988, it was time for them to build their own ground-up coasters. Still with a nostalgic mentality after working on restoring historic rides, the first would be Raging Wolf Bob's at Ohio's Geauga Lake. While not an exact replica, this would be inspired by the Bobs that used to operate at Chicago's Riverview Park, and as a result, this would have modest stats, with a more classic-style ride experience. After an 80-foot lift, the coaster would take a shallow drop into an elongated turnaround, and as the name would imply, the coaster would bob and weave through the course, staying low to the ground, including a segment where the coaster would pass through the same turnaround 3 times. Also heavily inspired by a classic they had just worked on, the other coaster of the year, Wolverine Wildcat at Michigan's Adventure, would undeniably take design cues from Knobel's Phoenix. Beginning with its own tunnel, the coaster would start up a similar-sized lift, before essentially the same layout at an angle, with updated banking hills instead of the straight found on Phoenix. Even retaining the double-up, double-down hill, this was clearly meant to be a modern take on the classic-style ride experience. With this new injection of competition, wooden coasters would finally see a year with 4 new additions again, and these wouldn't be minor relocations or tribute coasters. Among these would be 2 coasters from Bill Cobb, a year before his passing, with the first being the tiny Tree Topper at Upper Clements Park in Nova Scotia. At just 1,400 feet of track, this coaster would begin up a 60-foot lift, and fitting to its name, complete some small dips above the trees, before 3 surprising sizable drops and a meek turn into the brakes. The other would be the first large-scale wooden coaster outside of North America in over 30 years, with Anaconda opening with France's Big Bang Schroetumpf. With nearly 4,000 feet of track, the coaster would stand 118 feet tall, good for the 4th tallest in the world, and drop to near ground level, straight into a layout composed of large hills, all taken at a decent pace. The final 2 would be the next 2 coasters from the new Dinh Corporation, and as previously mentioned, these would be no small tributes, but massive coasters both over 4,000 feet in track. The first would be Timberwolf at Worlds of Fun, starting straight into a 100-foot lift before a turn into a large drop. After flying through a turnaround and 2 banking dips through the lift structure, the coaster would rise through a large double helix, burning off a lot of speed, before another 2 hills and a turn under the original, before a finale with a few quick banking hills. The other would be Hercules at Dorney Park, and while having a shorter height and track length, this would be the first wooden coaster with a drop over 150 feet, diving down a hillside into an aggressive flat turn over water, soaring through at 65 miles per hour. After rising back up the hill and burning a lot of speed, the coaster would dive under the station and through a speed hill, before an elongated turnaround and a quick pop with a sharp turn giving a blast of lateral G-force. After a couple more hills and another turn, the coaster would return to the station, and this and Timberwolf would both make a big statement for the Dinh Corporation. These aggressive layouts would push wooden coasters further than had been attempted over the past few years, raising the ceiling for taller, faster, and longer rides to come. Starting a new decade where the coaster wars would officially be in full spring, Dinh would fully come into their own, opening 4 new Woodies of all sizes across the country. Kicking it off would be Curtis D. Summers' take on the famous Cyclone layout, this time as an exact mirror image with Georgia Cyclone at Six Flags Over Georgia. Next would be Thunder Run at Kentucky Kingdom, and while standing at a modest 90 feet and under 3,000 feet of track, it would pack quite a punch, with a drop directly into a low bank turn similar to Hercules, before 3 lightning-fast hills packed with airtime. After another low turnaround, the coaster would rise up before a speed hill and a high turnaround with another hill before returning to the station. Third would be the first coaster of the year over 3,000 feet and tied Georgia Cyclone in height with Darien Lake's Predator. This wouldn't be the most inspired layout, just a double out and back with a variety of large hills, but featured a picturesque lakeside setting. These 3 would all serve as the appetizer to what Din was cooking up for the year though, as Six Flags Over Texas would debut the Texas Giant, standing as the new tallest wooden coaster and reaching nearly 5,000 feet of track. Dropping 137 feet, the coaster would complete 3 large leftward turning drops like a bucking bronco, before rising into a high mid-course brake run, allowing the headline coaster to run 3 trains. After 2 more left-turning drops, the coaster would finally go right and through a giant double helix, ascending and descending throughout, before 2 fast left and right turning hills and quick drops before returning to the station. Texas Giant would live up to its name, full of all the forces and speeds you love to see on a Woody, and further pushing Din to break more wooden coaster records. The next year would see more diversity of Woodies, with the first relocated coaster in a while, the Wildcat, coming to Frontier City from Fairyland Park. While other relocations had been done completely faithfully to this point, the park and John Pierce, who helped fit the ride into the park, made some drastic modifications to the original design, replacing the more common elevated turnarounds with more wild banking, and adding a double-down drop through the water as a finale. The other 3 coasters would come from Din, including a 4th Cyclone layout with Cyclone at Six Flags Magic Mountain. This would interestingly run heavy metal trains from new Swiss manufacturer Bolliger & Mabillard, clunking through this exact same clone layout. Next would be Din's only international coaster, with Pegasus opening at Efteling, but not so smoothly. Due to contract disputes, workers from Din would go on strike, leading to Charles Din closing his firm and having the project finished by Intamin, who hadn't built a wooden coaster since American Eagle. As for the ride itself, it would be a tiny coaster under 50 feet, featuring an incredibly simple oval layout along a lake. While the Din Corporation would seemingly already be over just when it was getting started, they would manage to open 1 more coaster before their closing, and thankfully, it would not only be their largest yet, but once again outdo all of Texas Giant's records to become the new tallest wooden coaster in the world. Mean Streak at Cedar Point would overall be like a mirror to Texas Giant, with a huge, now world's tallest 155-foot drop into a series of rightward turning hills, before rising into a mid-course, but featuring a more diverse second half, with multiple passes through the structure and faster pacing without a helix. While the Din Corporation would only last a short 4 years of building their own layouts, the impact they made was great, pushing to build larger and larger coasters every year, and making parks realize wooden coasters could be more than just nostalgic rides from the past. With the end of the Din Corporation and the beginning of many other new legacies, 1992 would be a massive turning point year, and would start off with yet another relocation, and a relocation of a very recent coaster. Don Rosser's Florida Hurricane would close with the many times renamed Boardwalk in baseball and be sent to Magic Springs, where it would open as Arkansas Twister. This would be a completely faithful relocation, and it was nice to see such a new ride be spared in a new scenic location. This year would sadly see the last two designs from the two designers who had carried wooden coasters the last 15 years. And while Bill Cobb had died 2 years before, he had designed a final coaster before his passing. Sierra Tonante, or Thunderous Mountain, would be Italy's first and only modern wooden coaster at the brand new Mirabilandia, and would be helped installed by Werner Stengel. This would climb over 100 feet before dropping into two hills with a turn in between, and another turn into a helix that would dive to ground level. After that, the coaster would rise into another hill before a finale built directly under the track of the first two hills, before returning to the station. Curtis D. Summers, with no more din, would design his final coaster for Intamin, and would sadly pass 2 months before the epic Jupiter would open at Kajima Kogen. This would also be the first wooden coaster for a country, this time Japan, and would be a statement one to start with, opening as the fourth tallest and third longest wooden coaster in the world. This beast would roll out of the station through an elongated pre-lift section, gaining some serious speed with an airtime hill mixed in, before climbing 138 feet into a giant swooping drop, before diving straight to ground level. After climbing through an elevated helix and down another large drop, the coaster would travel a double out and back section with a mid-course in between, before returning to the station. While it was sad to see both of these legends go, both would go out on top with epic international designs worthy of their legacy. Talking about such a small coaster after a titan like Jupiter seems silly, but the next coaster would be the first from a pivotal new manufacturer, Custom Coasters International. Founded by Charles Din's children, Jeff Din and Denise Din Larrick, alongside her husband Randy Larrick, they would essentially pick up where their father left off, and would push the next generation of wooden coaster designers. Bill Kelly, Larry Bill, who worked under Curtis D. Summers, and in this ride's case, Mike Boodley, a former employee of Philadelphia Toboggan Company. Sky Princess would open at Pennsylvania's Dutch Wonderland with a child-sized 55-foot height, and would swoop into a tiny first drop before a double up and a turnaround with a series of hills and an upwards helix to return to the station. Even with this tiny ride, it was already clear these coasters would be from a new generation, with faster transitions than seen before, but still being able to maintain a smooth and thrilling ride. Also starting this year would be yet another company, this time the much more infamous Roller Coaster Corporation of America, under President Michael and Stephen Black. While CCI knew to start small to perfect their craft, RCCA would dive straight into building the tallest wooden coaster in the world, as well as the fourth longest and tied for the fastest. The Rattler would open with the brand new Fiesta Texas, standing nearly 180 feet tall, and with the dynamic location of being half built into a rock quarry wall. Designed by John Pierce, who had only worked on the Wildcat relocation the previous year, this Rattler would live up to its name with anything but a smooth ride experience, beginning with arguably the most wild first drop on any coaster for the time, banking wildly to the right and swooping straight down off the rock cliff, before flying into a massive hill that would also drop down off the wall to near ground level. After soaring back up above the wall, the coaster would complete a massive, awkward, meandering helix before gaining all its speed back by again diving off the cliff and then into a tunnel through the rock wall itself, before finishing with another helix full of awkward profiling. While undeniably a beast of a structure and taking place in one of the most dynamic locations for any coaster, the Rattler was not the best first impression of RCCA, as the questionable tracking and transitions left a lot to be desired, and maybe went too far for what wooden coaster design was capable of at the time. The next year would begin with a break from coasters from established designers and companies for a true passion project at the small Cincinnati picnic park, Stricker's Grove. Tornado would be designed by Al Collins, who had helped build the Beast back in the day, and would be modeled after Mighty Lightnin' from Pennsylvania's Rocky Glen Park. This modest double out and back coaster would drop into turnarounds with 2 hills between each, providing a classic and surprising feel. This year would also see the next coaster from Mike Boodley, with already his last coaster for CCI, Outlaw at Adventureland. Beginning with a fun pre-lift, the coaster would drop into a unique swooping curving drop, which would become a Mike Boodley staple, followed by a layout with more banking and twists than had ever been seen before. Going out and around itself on 2 passes, this would take the twister layout to the next level and prove wooden coaster design could be pushed even further on a smaller scale. If the second wooden coaster resurgence wasn't already clear, 1994 would certainly show it, with 7 new coasters, the most in a year since decades before. Starting it off would be the last large-scale relocated coaster, and an important one at that, with the Comet from Ontario's Crystal Beach. Sticking around the top 5 longest wooden coasters all the way until 1989, this would be the year the ride would close, before sitting in storage at Fantasy Island in Niagara Falls, before making its way across New York to open at the Great Escape. This would thankfully take no liberties with the layout, restoring the fantastic Cyclone-style layout with a barrage of airtime moments including a double down. After that, King's Dominion and Carowinds, who were now owned by Paramount, would open 2 identical coasters as the only from a company named International Coasters Inc. Based on the Wayne's World SNL films, these coasters, named the Hurler, would be mirror image remakes of Din's layout for Thunder Run, although with less polish than Kentucky Kingdom's coaster. Next would be another 2 coasters from CCI, starting with Zach's Zoomer at Michigan's Adventure, their take on the classic Jet Flyer layout. The other would be the far larger Hoosier Hurricane at Indiana Beach, built with an all-steel structure partially over water, and more significantly, the first design from Larry Bill. After an S-turn at the top, the coaster would drop inches above Lake Schaefer before a double up and drop under the entry bridge, and a last turnaround with a series of large hills on the return. The last 2 coasters of the year would take us back to Japan, where Yomiuri Land would debut the second RCCA coaster, White Canyon. This John Pierce designed Cyclone layout would be a fairly standard mirror remake with some slight banking tweaks and a double up, as well as running one-of-a-kind trains from Japanese manufacturer Togo with an obtrusive overhead cage. The better White Coaster would open 300 kilometers away at Nagashima Spa Land, with the massive White Cyclone opening as the 4th tallest and 2nd longest wooden coaster. Made by Intamin, this would be their first design from Dennis Starkey, rolling out of the station with a long turn before the 139-foot lift and a turn at the top before the 129-foot drop. Rising into a hill, The ride would traverse a classic element from an Intamin wooden coaster, a giant elevated double helix, before dropping into a hill and another incline helix into a mid-course brake run. After that would be a couple more hills and one more helix, before returning to the station, completing the 5,577-foot ride. '95 would match '94's 7 coasters, beginning with an in-house coaster at Gulliver's World in England, Antelope. Designed by Scottish-based Allett and Lomax, this would stand at a mere 30 feet and complete a simple double out and back with a small dip into straight track before returning to the station. Speaking of the United Kingdom, the next coaster would open in India of all places, at Esselworld, with a tiny orange coaster named Zipper Dipper, modeled off the coaster of the same name at Blackpool Pleasure Beach. After that would be the 6th Cyclone layout and the second coaster from Dennis Starkey, with Viper at Six Flags Great America, with the near identical mirror layout of Georgia Cyclone. After closing the year before, Denver's Elitch Gardens would be relocated, and with that would come a remake of their famous John C. Allen coaster, Mr. Twister. Twister 2 would be the last design from John Pierce, and be slightly larger with over 1,500 more feet of track, while still being a very faithful homage. Beginning with its famous curving pre-drop, the coaster would drop into a turnaround and a curving hill, before the signature swooping double helix, before a low hill in a tunnel with some aptly named twists before returning to the station. The year would close out with 3 coasters from CCI, with the smallest being Cannonball Run at Waterville, USA in Alabama. Standing just 65 feet, this simple out and back would have a curving drop and feature a double up and a tight turnaround before its airtime-filled return run to the station. The other 2 would be much more significant, with 2 designs from Larry Bill as the first real coasters at 2 small Midwestern parks. For years, large parks focused on breaking records and building larger and larger coasters every year, but CCI would prove small parks could thrive with mid-scale coasters that could pack a punch, beginning with Cyclops at Wisconsin's Big Chief Carts and Coasters. Standing 70 feet tall and under 2,000 feet of track, this would shock riders with a wild curving drop into 2 rapid-fire hills and left-to-right twists full of laterals, which will become a staple for Larry Bill coasters. After working its way back up a hill, the ride would complete a famous drop that would be larger than the first, right into a low turn before a final banked hill and turning into the brake run. In a similar vein, the small Holiday World in Indiana would open the Raven, standing taller and with nearly 1,000 more feet of track than Cyclops. Starting straight up an 80-foot lift, the coaster would drop straight into a tunnel before 2 right-turning hills, with the second alongside a lake, before another dip and rising into a pause before a surprise large drop to ground level, much like Cyclops. From there, the coaster would have breakneck pacing through the trees, curving left and right before charging into the brakes. While on paper these Woodies, who didn't come close to cracking any records, seemed like nothing major, this is what would propel CCI into their niche, providing affordable and wild layouts for smaller parks with very modern designs. '96 would be the 3rd year in a row with 7 wooden coasters, with CCI dominating, contributing to 5 of those. Before that, though, would be the small teddy bear at Stricker's Grove, a junior Woody modeled after the coaster of the same name that used to operate at the nearby Coney Island. Iowa's Adventureland would work with CCI again to build their 3rd Woody, but this would be no ordinary coaster, as the underground would be more of a dark ride with coaster track. Rolling through an entirely indoor layout, the ride would pass multiple figures and effects with 2 lifts between, freely coasting through before returning to the station. A year after Cyclops, CCI would return to Big Chiefs for Pegasus, a ride intended to be a family coaster, but still packing a serious punch, featuring a bizarre layout with completely unbanked turns full of laterals, including a famous one into the station. The first major coaster of the year would open at Idaho's Silverwood, originally named the Grizzly, but more commonly known as Timber Terror, featuring a classic L-shaped layout full of elements one would come to expect from a CCI coaster. Turning into a steep drop, the ride would complete a series of sharp hills, including a double-up, before a trademark CCI turnaround, with minimal banking and full of laterals, before an airtime-filled return to the station with another helix mixed in. The next would be the Great White at New Jersey's Morey's Piers, a 110-foot giant partially built on the boardwalk and partially built directly over sand. Dropping right out of the station and under the boardwalk through a turning tunnel, the ride would drop into another lateral-filled layout, soaring above the pier and turning around the structure, before a series of return hills and a turn directly over rides, and a final steep drop before turning into the brakes. CCI's last coaster of the year would go across the pond to Oakwood Theme Park in Wales, with Megaphobia opening with a twisted layout along a lakeside setting. Turning 180 degrees and down a steep drop, the coaster would curve through a low turn over the water before charging over a hill and through another meekly banked turnaround, before another series of sharp hills and turns along the hillside. But after a few short years, it was time for yet another new wooden coaster manufacturer, as Mike Boodley had left Custom Coasters International just 2 years after its conception to create Great Coasters International, along with Claire Hayne Jr. They would open their first coaster this year, the Wildcat at Hershey Park, a fairly sized coaster full of the twists and turns Boodley had introduced with Outlaw. Rolling through a tiny pre-drop, the coaster would have a similar curving drop before a layout without an inch of unbanked track, in stark contrast to CCI's coasters, for a more comfortable and in-control experience. While Wildcat and CCI's coasters of this year and the past few aren't as fun to talk about compared to the giants trying to break every record, they were doing something more important, progressing wooden coaster design and profiling to be capable of more dynamic curves and forces than the titans that had come before them. After the 90s had seen wooden coaster design progress drastically, the year would begin with a true throwback to the days of old, with England's Rotunda Amusement Park opening Runaway Coaster, a classic 1920s side friction coaster. The other 4 coasters of the year would continue the dominance of CCI, with the first completing the Greek trilogy of coasters at Big Chief's Karts and Coasters. Zeus, King of the Gods, would fittingly be the largest coaster of the 3, and complete a fast-paced out-and-back layout featuring Larry Bill's classic quick hills and a lateral-filled turnaround. Surprisingly not the only Zeus-themed Woody of the year, Parc Astérix outside of Paris would build Tonnerre de Zeus, or Thunder of Zeus, and stand far larger than its American counterpart, while also just beating out Anaconda to become the largest wooden coaster in France. This large double out and back would drop straight into a grassy tunnel with a face, before charging through turnarounds and a flurry of hills, with an upward helix mixed in. Staying in Europe, the new PortAventura in Spain would open 3 total CCI coasters intertwined with each other in their Western-themed land. The smaller family coaster, Tomahawk, would drop and rise into a turn under the drop of the larger coasters, before meandering above and below with a large swooping drop mixed in between. These larger coasters would not only be CCI's first double coaster, but be the first racing Woodies in over 10 years since Le Monster, with Stampede, much like Larry Bill's other coasters, not worried about being the largest coaster, but a new age dynamic thrilling racer. Both would begin exactly parallel up the lifts, before dropping into a series of hills and turns, including a double up, before an ingeniously placed tunnel, splitting the tracks from each other. The blue side would dive to the right before curving left, while the red side would drop down and rise into a large hill, before both would meet up for a surprise head-to-head flyby. After this, blue would drop through the structure and rise up, and red would complete another large hill to allow blue to catch up, before meeting again to be perfectly parallel and complete a final turn into the brake run. While on paper this seems like a step back of a year, the resurgence of Woodies in Europe and CCI's new take on a racing coaster would inspire even more design creativity. "1998 would return to 7 coasters for the year, beginning with another coaster from Intamin, who likes to show up every once in a while to make a new Woody. Asuka would be their take on the Coney Island Cyclone at Japan's Nara Dreamland, this one being a very faithful and well-tracking version. Great Coasters International would see their second coaster open at Adventure World, a year before it would be renamed to Six Flags America, with Roar. Beginning with a twisting pre-lift, the coaster would dip into a trademark Boodley curving drop before another twisted layout of turns and hills, including an elongated section with a covered tunnel. Like the rest of the decade though, this year would be dominated by CCI, starting with Rampage opening alongside Alabama's Visionland, which would be a near clone of Megaphobia, standing larger and along a similar hillside setting. CCI would continue their additions to small parks, with Excalibur at Funtown Splashtown, USA in Maine, and much like GCI's Roar, this would be a twister layout. Unlike Boodley's coaster though, this would be another flat turn, lateral-filled layout from Larry Bill, charging through turns and over hills in a wooded setting. Next would be another venture into a double coaster, with Kentucky Kingdom, recently acquired by Six Flags, opening Twisted Sisters, quickly having to change its name to Twisted Twins after a dispute from the band with the same name. This Woody would be the first to feature trains from German manufacturer Gerstlauer. Very similar to the two-bench trains nearly every Woody was running from PTC, but with more defined individual seats and different exterior styling. Rolling out of the station in opposite directions, the two sisters, Stella and Lola, would pass each other parallel but in the opposite direction, before turning and dropping at each other in a tight head-to-head flyby in the valley. Stella would wrap around the lift, and Lola would continue past, with both layouts then following the identical path but in opposite directions, leading to a second flyby at one point in the ride and a helix for each, with each layout being filled with laterals before each brake run. While CCI had amassed a wild 20 coasters in just 7 years, at a rate that hadn't been attempted for wooden coasters in nearly a century, they still weren't done, with 2 more coasters for the year that would push their design limits to places they hadn't gone before. First, the historic Knott's Berry Farm in Anaheim, California, which is always tight on space, would fit the massive Ghost Rider in the historic Ghost Town section of the park. This ingeniously designed L-shaped double out and back would be another masterful design from Larry Bill, and while still not cracking the height and speed records from its neighboring Colossus, it would just beat the length of one of its sides, and be a far more action-packed experience. After tumbling out of the station and up a 118-foot lift, the coaster would drop straight before curving at the bottom and charging through a hill before a giant banking turnaround, before flying back and up into a huge flat turnaround wrapping around the lift. Steeply dropping straight off of this, the coaster would zip through a banking turn before following the first turnaround in the opposite direction, and a final hill before a signature double helix finale with plenty of laterals packed in. With ample size, speed, and forces, Ghost Rider would make a strong case for the new best wooden coaster out there, but CCI's next would perhaps be even better, with Shivering Timbers opening at Michigan's Adventure. This small park, which was opening their third Woody in 10 years, would go big, opening as the fourth longest wooden coaster and stand with a presence not seen on a Woody. Steel Titans had been growing through the 90s, with a series of huge hypercoaster-style hills, and Shivering Timbers would be CCI's answer to this, with a layout of 13 pure straight airtime hills of all kinds of sizes. Also mixing in a CCI lateral-filled turnaround and a double helix finale, the only other break in the action would be a trick track, where on a straight section the train would rock side to side. Depending on your preferences, these two giants would plant the flag as the two best modern wooden coasters, full of cutting-edge profiling, speed, and airtime, and catch the attention of more parks to let them know how big CCI could go. For the fifth time in 6 years, the 90s would conclude with 7 wooden coasters opening, and surprisingly, the least notable would be the only 2 coasters from CCI. First would be Silver Comet at Martin's Fantasy Island near Niagara Falls, standing with a modest CCI size, but packing in another layout full of laterals, beginning with 2 hills before a series of rising and dropping turnarounds. Among a similar size, Silverwood would open their second CCI with Tremors, featuring a clever twisted out and back layout. Dropping straight into back-to-back underground hills, including one under the exit shop, the coaster would rise through a large helix, before a turnaround with a series of hills, and another 2 underground hills before returning to the station. After a 5-year absence, RCCA would return with 2 coasters, beginning with the 8th, and at this time, final Coney Island Cyclone layout, with Wild Wild West at Warner Bros. Movie World, Germany. While this fairly standard rendition of this classic layout would be more of the same, Montezuma at Hopi Hari would bring RCCA back to their boundary-pushing ways, and open as the first and only major wooden coaster in South America. Cracking the top 5 tallest drops on a Woody, this would take a twisting plunge under a road, before a series of large hills and turns, with a helix mixed in, before returning to the station. Following these would be an uncommon in-house coaster, as the nostalgic Knoebels would build Twister, inspired by the original Mr. Twister at Elitch Gardens. While inspired, this would make many more changes than Twister 2 had just 4 years before, beginning with the lift hill of all places, with a one-of-a-kind split lift. Once reaching the top of the first lift, the train would complete a tight turn before engaging the second, all using one long chain to help the coaster fit into a smaller footprint. After reaching the top and completing the twisting pre-drop, many elements would be mirrored, while others would follow the original path, but still completed the large wrapping double helix and quick twists before a modified ending. The final 2 Woodies of the decade would be the next 2 from Great Coasters International, and while the first would be another clone of Roar for Six Flags Marine World, it would debut a major train change for GCI and wooden coasters as a whole. Outside of the new Gerstlauer trains made for Twisted Sisters, Nearly every wooden coaster the past few decades had used standard Philadelphia Toboggan Company 2-bench or 3-bench cars, with each car of the train featuring 2 wheel assemblies. GCI would unveil their new trains they called Millennium Flyers, preceding the new millennium, consisting of single cars with a curving T-bar, arranged very similar to old-style Frederick Church trains. These were the trains GCI believed would usher in the new modern age, with the single cars capable of taking tighter turns through their twisted layouts with more freedom. Their other coaster would not open with these trains, but be far larger as their first double coaster with Gwazi at Busch Gardens, Tampa. Consisting of 2 sides named Lion and Tiger, these would roll out of the station for the first of 6 record-setting flybys, before dipping under the queues and climbing 2 opposite-facing lifts. After curving through pre-lifts at the top, the 2 would fly head-to-head, before turning back towards each other, with Lion piercing the structure, before another head-to-head flyby in the following valley. After both sides would complete a twisting left turn, they would rise through a 4th flyby, banking to face each other, and then make twisting return trips towards the station for yet another flyby, perpendicular to the station. After this, Lion would complete a low-to-the-ground helix, and Tiger would complete its own twister section before the final flyby into the brake run. While each side on their own wouldn't be too much larger than GCI's 3 coasters before, its twisted structure with exciting near misses made it a notable coaster, and a fun way to end this prosperous decade. The year 2000 serves as the perfect climax to the roller coaster wars that had been building through the 90s, with dozens of massive steel coasters opening, breaking records never thought possible before. This would be no exception for wooden coasters as well, and while the previous decade had seen 5 years with 7 coasters debut, 2000 would double that alone, with a staggering 14 opening around the world. For this, all hands would have to be on deck, including new ones still coming out in the case of Tennessee-based Coaster Works Inc. This mysterious company would only build 2 coasters, with one, Thunder Eagle at Race World in Pigeon Forge, being just as mysterious, with a single video available and only operating for 1 year. This would be an incredibly basic figure-8 out and back, with a height of only 70 feet and 2,500 feet of track. Their other coaster would operate a decade longer, the Dana Beach Hurricane at Florida's Boomers, completing a similar simple out and back layout, but with an L shape and at a larger size. While Intamin was beginning to build massive steel coasters, they still had time for a Woody, with Regina at Japan's Tobu Zoo, a large coaster over 4,000 feet of track and above water. This would be a huge double out and back, with a massive downward helix and a return run with a long series of bunny hills. Another European manufacturer known for building steel coasters would open a wood coaster this year as well, with Dutch company Vekoma building Robin Hood at the close-to-home Six Flags Holland. This would be Dennis Starkey's 3rd design for a 3rd manufacturer this year, as he had designed all coasters mentioned and presumably Thunder Eagle to this point. This would be a U-shaped layout, also built partially over water, with a modest size and a respectable series of hills and turns. Going on to the main wooden manufacturers, Great Coasters International would open just 1 coaster, being yet another double coaster, with Lightning Racer as their 2nd coaster at Hershey Park. This, like all GCIs going forward, would rock the Millennium Flyer trains, and would begin with the 2 sides, Thunder and Lightning, rolling out of the station into small turnarounds before climbing the parallel lifts. While next to each other and at the same height, Lightning would be offset forward, leading to a unique visual before the twisting first drops, followed by two parallel hills that would then break off for a twisting head-to-head flyby into a shed. The two would then complete two side-by-side low turns before another separating helix with a flyby, and a fun section where the two would meet up again with each side hopping over another, and one final flyby turnaround before racing each other into the brake run. The manufacturer who dominated the 90s would unsurprisingly build half the coasters for this year though, with Custom Coasters International reaching their climax, with 7 new coasters, all reaching 100 feet and surpassing 3,000 feet of track. All of these coasters but one would run Gerstlauer trains, with the first of these being the simply named Hurricane at Myrtle Beach Pavilion Amusement Park. Taking a straight drop into two fast-paced hills, the coaster would then rocket through one of Larry Bill's most maniacally designed double helixes yet, flying through and rising up and down before an airtime-filled return trip and a more simply designed lowering helix finale and hopping into the brake run. But speaking of maniacal helixes, Holiday World would open their second CCI coaster, and instead of the airtime-filled Raven, the Legend would be known for its wild lateral thrills. After a turnaround atop the lift, the coaster would take a curving drop with minimal banking into a tunnel, continuing that profile, rising up a hill before changing direction, and then rising into a swooping turnaround and the strongest airtime hill of the ride. Then flying into a large drop, the coaster would zip through two more low directional changes before the signature moment, a wild double helix with two separate tunnels, disorienting riders and piling on the lateral Gs. The coaster would then finish its return trip, turning back and forth low to the ground with more laterals and a 180-degree turn into the station. New Orleans would see a new park open with Jazzland, and with it, Mega Zeph, reaching 4,000 feet and careening down a 110-foot drop. Following a standard double out and back oval layout, Larry Bill would do what he did best and pack the coaster full of exciting hills and fast turns, including a picturesque turn over water, followed by a series of 6 hills and a classic helix finale. Six Flags would reach their peak of spending in 2000, including the aforementioned Robin Hood and 3 coasters from CCI, the shortest of which being Medusa at the renamed for this year Six Flags Mexico. Beginning like many coasters this year with a turnaround after the lift, this would follow a similar drop to the Legend, but into a much more twisted layout, with nearly no straight track, but unlike GCI coasters, this would pack in the essential CCI laterals. Squeezed into a compact footprint, this masterful design would rise and fall through countless turnarounds and twisted hills, wrapped around an oval in the middle. Next would be the Villain at the newly acquired Six Flags Ohio, a more traditional style large double out and back filled with more low hills and plenty of speed and lateral turns. Six Flags' last Woody of the year would be the largest, taking CCI to their greatest heights and speeds ever with the Boss at Six Flags St. Louis. Climbing 122 feet and around another 180-degree turnaround, this would drop down a uniquely shallow drop, flattening out at the bottom through the structure before a surprise extra dip into a wild turning speed hill that would transition into a giant turnaround. Dropping off that with great speed, the coaster would rip through another turning speed hill before rising into another large turnaround, burning off all its speed, turning into a super tall mid-course brake run. After another giant drop and turnaround, the coaster would complete a low-to-the-ground second half, with a series of hills before another signature double helix finale before a final hop into the brakes. Still going above and beyond that, CCI would open a second masterclass design this year, with the second being Boulder Dash at Lake Compounce. While many wooden coasters have featured terrain layouts, this may be the most ambitious, hugging a hillside and soaring through trees and rocks, further increasing the sensation of speed through the ride. Reaching the top of the mountainside, the train would cruise along a right turn before a twisting drop, hardly banking and continuing the massive swoop to ground level and up two humps, before finally changing directions and pummeling riders with lateral forces and down another large drop. The coaster would then continue in a seemingly endless stretch along the cliff, with countless hills, dips, and turns past boulders and trees, before reaching the end of the leg and completing a second twisting lateral drop to begin the return run. This would be an airtime buffet along the actual lake compounds, with hills of various sizes and shapes, with small turns and a mini trick track built in, before one final large drop that would lead into the breaks. Any other year, Boulder Dash, Boss, and the many other masterpiece layouts from custom coasters would be enough. But there would be two more from a familiar but less established manufacturer that would really steal the attention. Roller Coaster Corporation of America, who had built two Cyclone layouts and two boundary-pushing coasters, would be challenged to push the limits of wooden coaster design even more, with the first being Magnus Colossus at Spain's Terra Mítica. Much like Boulder Dash and other coasters this year, this would be a terrain coaster, but instead of a wooded setting, this would climb a dry, rocky mountain and begin with a large 118-foot double-down drop. After that, the lapse in design capability from CCI would be on full display, as while the coaster had size and speed, it wouldn't do much besides some high turns, before a final cliffside drop and a helix into the breaks. The last of the year would be the culmination of everything wooden roller coasters had been leading up to the past 30 years, and fittingly done by the park who started the wooden coaster revival. Kings Island, now owned by Paramount, was ready to make a huge statement in the roller coaster wars, and just like in Hollywood, they looked to do it through a sequel, as this would be a follow-up to The Beast. Still standing as the longest in the world and top 5 in speed, instead of breaking those records, the park would build upwards, and thus, Son of Beast would open as the world's tallest and fastest wooden coaster. This would be done by no small margin either, as this would be the first Woody to pass 200 feet, and going even further to reach a whopping 218 feet tall. Just as a spoiler for the future, even Steel Vengeance, standing as the tallest wooden structure on a coaster today, is still 13 feet shorter than this, making it seem like a record that only Son of Beast will ever be able to hold. Rolling out of the station with one-of-a-kind trains from steel coaster manufacturer Premier Rides, this would swoop down a sizable drop and a large bank turn before beginning the climb up the colossal structure. This wouldn't just take a simple straight drop either, as a forest of support structure would be used for a large swooping pre-drop before the giant 214-foot plunge at a steep 55-degree angle. At the bottom of this drop, the train would break the speed record with an absurd 78 miles per hour, another record that hasn't come close and probably will never be broken today. The coaster would then blast up a gargantuan S-turning hill before dropping into a massive double helix much like its father, dubbed the Rose Bowl. This would end in a mid-course through the structure, before another large drop into the most iconic element that was shocking to see on a wooden coaster, with the first successful vertical loop. This would use steel supports, and itself stood 118 feet, taller than a majority of the coasters this year alone. This would be followed by another nearly double helix, followed by a hill and another turn, before finally hopping into the breaks. While the meandering nature of the Beast was charming due to its old-school in-house design and fantastic wooded setting under the trees, Son of Beast, which would also be the second longest wooden coaster ever and the only other to pass 7,000 feet of track, would not be as well received. This would be due to RCCA and wooden coaster technology in general not ready to produce such a massive ride, leading it to have one of the worst reputations of any roller coaster for its insanely rough ride at breakneck speeds. Its reputation was so bad, it would never even place in the top 30 of wooden coasters in Amusement Today's Golden Ticket Awards, a list nearly every other manufacturer this year would place higher on at some point. While undeniably important in wooden coaster history, it serves more as a cautionary tale, as some records maybe aren't meant to be broken. After a year that will never be topped in wooden coaster production, 2001 brought things back to basics with a comfortable 6 new coasters from 3 different manufacturers. Vekoma would build their next 2 and last 2 Woodies in Europe, beginning with Loopgarou at the recently rebranded Six Flags Belgium. This would be Dennis Starkey's last design, following a simple double out and back layout before a turning outward leg and a helix into the brakes. The other would be a far departure, with Thunder Coaster at Tusenfryd in Norway, featuring a far more twisty layout. Listed to be designed as the only other coaster by Scottish-based Allett and Lomax, who had only built the simple Antelope before this. Beginning with a twisting, Boodley-esque plunge, the coaster would rip through the layout with very sharp hills, including the first large one that would drop below ground level. Next would be 2 modest-sized coasters from CCI, the first being Cheetah at Wild Adventures in Georgia. This simple out and back would drop straight into 2 sharp hills, before a low-to-the-ground turnaround and more hills, before a figure 8 finale. The other would be Cornball Express at Indiana Beach, featuring a layout that would circle the existing Tiger Coaster and other buildings, and built right into the structure of the existing Hoosier Hurricane. Beginning up a lift parallel but in the opposite direction of Hurricane, the train would take a wild banking drop before the full circling loop around the existing rides, and entering a small helix and completing the circle back to the station but in the opposite direction. The last 2 of the year would come from Intamin. First, their final traditional style Woody with Elf at Japan's Hirakata Park. This family-sized coaster would stand at 60 feet and take meek dips through a double out and back figure 8 style layout that would be perfect for all ages. The other would be the true innovation wooden coasters would need if manufacturers really wanted to break records while maintaining a comfortable ride, as Intamin would attempt to reinvent the building process wooden coasters had used for over 100 years. Instead of arriving on the construction site with boards of wood and then hand-cutting the track into the desired shape, Intamin would laser cut and bend the wood boards and steel plates off-site, and then ship those pre-cut pieces to simply be snapped together in person, much like how steel coasters are produced. This would fine-tune the entire process, helping manage forces and correct track imperfections, leading to the smoothest and most advanced wooden coaster design seen yet. The first coaster to open with this pre-cut track would be Colossus at Germany's Heidi Park, and Intamin would go all out, making this the 3rd tallest and 2nd fastest wooden coaster in the world. Reaching the top of the lift, the train would complete a 90-degree turn and plunge down a super steep 61-degree drop, and absolutely rocket over 2 back-to-back hills with forces never attempted before. After a large swooping turnaround, the train would rise into another 2 hills before a downward helix and another series of 3 hills before turning into the brakes. As far as a prototype model goes, this could not have been much better for Intamin, and while there had been some excellent wooden coaster designs through the 90s, this would be the way they could advance into the 21st century. "2002 would be another major turning point for wooden coasters, much like 1992 a decade before, as the 3 coasters of the year would be the last from 2 major manufacturers from the previous 10 years. RCCA, who already did not have the best reputation to begin with, would be under major fire for their poor work on Son of Beast, and would produce their last coaster this year, Wild Wild West, at Warner Bros. Park, Madrid. Sharing the same name as another RCCA coaster at a European park from the same movie studio, this would not be a cyclone layout, rather a large twisting layout that would stand 120 feet tall and with over 4,500 feet of track. The coaster would have a bizarre layout, dropping straight into a massive rightward turning helix and rising through 3 more rightward turning hills, before rising and finally changing direction to turn left into a helix and 2 more left turns into the brakes. As to be expected from RCCA, this ride tracked extremely poorly, and while this bad manufacturer would end on a whimper, the final 2 coasters from CCI would end on a high note. Unfortunately, the company spread themselves too thin through the 90s, accepting bids to produce rides at a rate they couldn't keep up with, leading many projects, including these final 2 coasters, to be left incomplete due to their bankruptcy and the parks themselves having to complete the coasters. The first of these would be the New Mexico Rattler at Cliffs Amusement Park, showing how a twisted layout should be done, with an L-shaped layout beginning with a swooping drop into a tunnel before a double up into an elongated turnaround. The coaster would then complete some low-to-the-ground humps before a double helix finale, dropping underground and rising again, before a final drop and a second double up before a helix into the station. Custom Coaster's final creation would be the furthest departure from anything they had done before, and complete a trilogy of coasters for Indiana Beach. While they had built a dark ride style coaster before with the Underground, Lost Coaster of Superstition Mountain would go much further, starting with its one-of-a-kind bizarre trains. This coaster would replace a powered single-car dark ride that had operated for 30 years at the park, built inside a small man-made mountain, and following the path of that dark ride, CCI would need to build their own trains to complete extremely tight turns in a radius standard trains couldn't. Their solution were 2-car trains where riders would face each other with essentially no restraint, and new wheel axles capable of traversing extremely tight hairpin turns, and topped off with a large cage overhead to keep riders from breaking the clearance envelope. The ride itself would then begin with another quirk, pulling into an elevator lift due to the lack of available space, and slowly climb to the top of the mountain. Rolling forward and beginning to dip and tightly twist down, the cars would weave through a scenic turn over the water before a series of twists and turns through the mountain. Including multiple fake-out endings, and after working its way further and further down the mountain, the train would rise up a small lift and return to the station. A strange but worthy ending to the manufacturer who had pushed wooden coaster design farther than any before them. When looking at the level of design from when they started to their ending, you can really see the leaps in dynamic design Larry Bill and all the other designers were able to achieve. And while their ending would be sad, it too would spawn a new era of companies and designers to push the boundaries even further. This new era would begin with a year featuring 4 coasters from 4 different manufacturers, starting with the second and only other wooden coaster in India, with Cyclone at Nicco Park. Sporting another orange structure, this would similarly be built by Blackpool Leisure Amusement Consultancy and be modeled after a classic UK Woody, this time the Cyclone at Southport Pleasureland, featuring the exact same simple figure 8 layout. Continuing on would be the next coaster from Mike Boodley and Great Coasters International, Ozark Wildcat at Celebration City in Branson, Missouri, beginning with a unique new drop, leveling out before curving down to ground level. This would then follow the formula for GCI, seemingly banking through the entire layout through countless twists with some hills mixed in for good measure. This year would see the next highly anticipated Intamin prefabricated wooden coaster, Balder at Sweden's Leesburg, and while the scale would be brought down from Colossus in every way, it would still be an airtime packed layout, beginning with a banking turn before straightening out into the steepest drop on a Woody at 70 degrees. The layout couldn't be more simple after that, a throwback to the oval figure 8 layouts of the past, but with perfectly smooth track and nearly a dozen ejector airtime hills. The final of the year would be a much more simple coaster, but the first from another new manufacturer. S&S was a manufacturer known for their shot and drop towers that were super popular through the 90s, and had just built their first 2 steel coasters with similar compressed air launch technology. After the legendary steel coaster manufacturer Aerodynamics had recently gone bankrupt the year before, S&S would acquire their assets, and most importantly, their growing designer Alan Schilke. Working alongside Denise Din Larrick, who had helped found CCI a decade before, the company's next coaster would be the Woody Timberhawk Ride of Prey at Wild Waves outside of Seattle. This coaster would be the only design from Dennis McNulty, standing as a very modestly sized double out and back layout, featuring a straight drop and a series of hills and turnarounds in a fairly standard, slower paced affair. – 2004 would begin with a small coaster from another manufacturer building their first wooden coaster, this time Quebec-based Martin and Vlemix. The coaster would be the Triple Hurricane, an opening day attraction at Cypress Gardens Adventure Park, as a tiny out-and-back coaster standing at 40 feet with 3 flat turnarounds and a series of fun small hills. Like many manufacturers, this small ride would be just the beginning of major things to come in the future, but in the meantime, this year would see the next and final 3 wooden coasters from S&S. These would all be designed by Alan Schilke, who had only designed steel coasters before, most notably the Insane X at Six Flags Magic Mountain, the first of its kind wild 4th dimension coaster. The first would be Tsunami at New Jersey's Clementon Park, standing next to the classic Jackrabbit from John A. Miller. This would begin with a steep 105-foot drop into 2 fast hills over water, before a super banked turn and a dip into an upwards helix. After that, the coaster would return with a series of small sharp hills and turns into the brakes, packing quite a punch for a small coaster. Packing even more of a punch would be Avalanche at Timber Falls Adventure Park in the Wisconsin Dells, another modest-sized coaster that would rip through an oval layout, dropping straight into a series of low turns and small hills at a wild pace. The last would be Falcon at Farup Summerland in Denmark, and while the smallest of the 3, it would also pack a punch, beginning with a turning pre-drop before falling into a tunnel and an elongated turnaround, before another series of low hills and an upward helix back to the station. Back in America, GCI would build their next coaster, and their final design from founder Mike Boodley. Located at the beautiful Dollywood in Tennessee, Thunderhead would stand at the same stature of most of GCI's coasters, but in a lush forested valley along a hillside. The layout would be another well-paced, twisted affair, but included a unique station fly-through with a straight track above where riders would board, before another series of dips and twists. "2005 would only feature one coaster, but it would be a Titan from another new manufacturer. After Custom Coasters International closed, much of its team would be spread across different companies in the industry, but the true successor would become the Gravity Group. Led by Larry Bill, who was responsible for the best of CCI, his new team included Corey Kiepert, Chad Miller, and Michael Graham, and would start out simply as a design firm, creating the layout for a new coaster at a park very familiar with Bill's designs from the past. Big Chief Karts and Coasters, who had opened 3 Greek mythological CCI coasters, would go full in on its theme this year, rebranding the park to Mount Olympus Theme Park, and with it, a new god would arise above the skyline. Hades would be built in-house, standing at a giant 136 feet, and when visitors pulled up, they would see the massive lift along the road, but seemingly drop into nothing. After taking a huge drop out of the station and through a wild pre-lift, riders would be plunged 160 feet below the parking lot into the underworld. A wild straightaway leg with small dips and a boundary-pushing 90-degree bank. Hopping out of the tunnel, the train would emerge on the other side of the parking lot and up a massive hill, before turning around and plunging back into the darkness. After a similar dark return with small turns and a trick track-like hill, the train would emerge and fly over another 2 hills before a twister finale through the trees and an upwards helix into the brakes. While the design engineers had their fair share of experience with large coasters, Hades was still quite the first impression from a new company, and stood as one of the most impressive wooden coasters ever built. While the quantity would be down from the height of production from the past, 2006 would still be a landmark year for wooden coasters, including the first 2 coasters from GCI without Mike Boodley. These would be designed by Jeff Pike, a former employee of D.H. Morgan, who would see over the design of GCI layouts to this day. The first of these would be Thunderbird at Finland's Power Park, a twisted double out and back with all the twists and drops you need, including a fun series of airtime hills at the end. The other would be back in America with Kentucky Rumbler at Beach Bend, another compact twister beginning with a wraparound drop similar to Ozark Wildcat. The train would then fly over a straight hill, before a far more low-to-the-ground layout than any GCI before it, and packing in many more standard straight airtime moments. While the GCI coasters were fun, the other 2 would be some of the most significant coasters in years, beginning with the imposing El Toro at Six Flags Great Adventure. A year after breaking records with the tallest and fastest coaster in Kingda Ka, the park would again work with Intamin to push similar records for their next massive prefabricated wooden coaster, standing as the second tallest and fastest out there. Rolling out of the station, the coaster would begin up a unique cable lift, a system Intamin had been implementing on their steel coasters to bring the train up faster and not needing such a long lift chain. After reaching the top, the train would turn 180 degrees before plunging down an unprecedented 76-degree drop, one of the steepest on any coaster period and easily the steepest of any wood, before soaring over two massive hills, providing even more extreme force than Colossus. The train would then fly through a large diving turnaround before cruising through two smaller hills, and a bank turn before an infamous hill that would climb over the racing Woody Rolling Thunder. After that, the coaster would conclude with a wildly paced twister finale, with design akin to what Intamin was implementing on their steel coasters, with 3 rapid-fire side-to-side twists on the ground before rising through a couple more bank turns before the brakes. While El Toro would bring the height and power, the next coaster from Gravity Group would bring the length, with the Voyage. Similar to Mount Olympus, Holiday World would be familiar with CCI design from their 2 coasters before, and build their own coaster in-house with Gravity Group's layout for another massive coaster. While just out of the top 5 in height, the coaster would still open as the 4th fastest and most significantly, 3rd longest at a whopping 6,442 feet, a massive feat for a coaster with just a single lift hill. The coaster would be evenly divided into 3 sections, with the first beginning with the massive straight first drop, 154 feet down, before a series of 4 large hills, with some dropping underground in tunnels to gain even more speed. The second section would be a large twister, hugging the ground through a long series of turns deep in the woods and way outside the park. After rising into a mid-course, the coaster would begin the 3rd return leg with a triple down into a tunnel before an incredible sequence of hills and turns, somehow not losing any speed and staying tight to the ground before flying under the station and rising through another final 2 turns into the brakes. The Voyage would live up to its namesake, taking riders on a fast-paced, seemingly endless journey, and helping Gravity Group begin perhaps the best start of any manufacturer with 2 massive wild coasters. While manufacturers were still pushing wooden coasters to their limits, 2007 began with 2 faithful relocations of classic rides of the past, beginning with Meteor at Wisconsin's Little America. This Herb Schmeck design from 1953 operated at 2 parks in Illinois before making its trip to the park, and featured a classic figure-8 junior layout with small dips. The other would be Starliner at Cypress Gardens, a very faithful relocation of one of Florida's oldest coasters that operated at Miracle Strip Amusement Park, a classic John C. Allen design. This simple out and back would sport a classic white color scheme and feature a series of many hills and a downward turnaround, retaining very classic 1960s shaping, and would sadly only operate for 2 years. Next would be another 2 Pike GCI layouts, beginning with Renegade at Valley Fair, starting with a one-of-a-kind drop that would bank right and then twist to the left down the descent, before flying over a low-to-the-ground strong hill. Along with some large turnarounds, this would stay mostly low to the ground, much like Kentucky Rumbler, with the turnarounds featuring extra kinks of airtime on the exits, and small dips throughout, including a finale along the midway. The other would be Troy at the growing Toverland, and GCI's longest and maybe best coaster yet, featuring the trademark twists and turnarounds mixed in with their best elements, dropping straight into a fast bank turn and featuring 2 helixes and a station fly-through. Finally, Gravity Group would open their third coaster, and while not reaching the heights or speeds of their first two, it would still be an incredibly impressive design for Boardwalk Bullet in Kemah, Texas. Teaming up with Martin and Vlemix to assist with construction, the coaster would stand nearly 100 feet and with over 3,000 feet of track, but take up a mere acre of land, taking advantage of every inch of the triple out and back twister layout. Turning 270 degrees off the lift hill, the coaster would take a steep drop into a low turn before a series of hills and turns, creatively going against the path of direction on every pass to make the layout not feel repetitive at all, and always finding new ways to drop and gain speed to finish the layout. "2008 would see 4 coasters from 4 manufacturers, with 3 being the ones you would expect, and the 4th being the only wooden coaster designed by German manufacturer Cordes Holzbau. Mammut at Erlbenspark Tripsdrill would stand a respectable 98 feet and use trains from fellow German manufacturer Gerstlauer, and begin with a completely unique show scene before the lift hill, featuring flashing lights and buzzsaws. The layout would then be reminiscent of an older GCI coaster, featuring the banked drops and twists, but at a smoother, slower pace and no extra quick pops, and end with a banking tunnel under the pathway. Next would be Evel Knievel completing a unique wooden trilogy at Six Flags St. Louis, using the exact same GCI layout as Thunderbird at Power Park. After that would be the next wild layout from Gravity Group at Pennsylvania's Waldameer, Ravine Flyer 2. Named and acting as the sequel to the infamous coaster of the same name from John A. Miller that closed in 1938, this ride would get its namesake by plunging down said ravine and over a one-of-a-kind bridge that would travel over a road as a tribute to the original coaster. While standing just 88 feet tall, the coaster would take a steep drop 118 feet down before banking and flying over the hill over the road, before a massive rising turnaround that would drop riders back over the hill and over the bridge. After a tunnel, the rest of the coaster would stay very low to the ground, completing 2 passes around the lift hill and train ride in a rectangular shape, and using the rest of the hillside to drop and gain more speed. The final coaster of the year would be the 4th and very sadly final prefabricated Woody from Intamin, T-Express at Korea's Everland, and by far their largest. This would beat El Toro's height by 2 feet and length by nearly 1,000, in a layout that would combine elements of all 3 previous prefabs into one. Beginning with an even steeper 77-degree drop, the train would rocket over a Colossus-like large and wild airtime hill before a fast turn and change of direction similar to El Toro, before rising into a midcourse. After this, the layout would interestingly follow an identical layout to the entirety of Balder, complete with the slower turns but packing in another near dozen airtime-packed hills. While seeing a model and a wooden coaster manufacturer in Intamin, who had been creating layouts for over 25 years, step away from the field would be very sad, the expensive to produce and even more expensive to maintain prefabricated track would prove to be unaffordable for most parks. But the concept would be revived and simplified by others in years to come. To be honest, from here on out, aside from one very significant manufacturer and innovation they made, and a couple other small endeavors, the state of wooden coasters as we know it from 2008 to today is simply owned by GCI and the Gravity Group. While these two will continue to make amazing, action-packed, fun rides, we won't be seeing many parks push the limits of wooden coasters like they tried in the 90s and early aughts, especially in America. This year would kick off with 3 of those GCI coasters, starting with another coaster named El Toro, and while sharing the name of the giant Intamin coaster, it would be the smallest of the year. Freizeitpark Plön is a family-friendly park in Germany, and this smaller-scale coaster would begin with a fun drop into a low turn that would take a second dip under a tunnel before changing direction twice before another turn into a second tunnel. After another long turn, the coaster would pack in a flurry of small straight hills and tight twists, using a very smart and well-paced design for such a small coaster. The next 2 would be back in America, beginning with Terminator Salvation the Ride at Six Flags Magic Mountain, a strange movie franchise to base a wooden coaster after. After an elaborate queue with props and videos featuring the T-800s, riders would board the Millennium Flyer trains, ambitiously featuring speakers and a box on the back car to power onboard audio that would play story and music from the films through the ride. As for the coaster itself, it would begin with another wraparound drop before a hill and another layout full of low turns and twists, much like Kentucky Rumbler, while featuring 2 tunnels, a station fly-through, and a fireball effect. The other would be Prowler at Worlds of Fun, taking inspiration from terrain out and back coasters before it, but adding in the trademark GCI twists and bumps. Dropping down the curving drop, the coaster would pierce through the lift and out into the woods, staying super low to the ground and hugging the natural terrain, before turning around and returning with another series of low hills and twists. The final would be the next from the Gravity Group, and the first of many not only wooden, but coasters in general in China, as the country would begin to build new parks at an incredible rate for the giant population. The first of these would be Wooden Coaster Fireball, a dense double out and back oval layout packed with an advertised 19 airtime moments, soaring through the layout with a flurry of hills, including some very quick dips for the finale and some large lateral turns mixed in as well. Also worth noting for its significance to the overall record holders, the problematic Son of Beast would end its lone decade of operation, which had included losing its signature loop and multiple accidents, bumping all rides below it up and allowing 2 Intamin prefabs to claim the tallest and fastest wooden coaster out there. The new decade would begin with the last known wooden coaster relocation, with the Little Dipper making its way around 30 miles from Kiddieland to Six Flags Great America. This would be a small Herb Schmeck layout, nearly identical to Meteor, which had been relocated a couple years before, and retaining the classic white paint scheme. The other coaster of the year would be the next from GCI, and to this point, their last racing coaster built at the world-renowned Efteling. Joris and De Draak would replace the small Intamin Woody Pegasus in a coaster where riders would choose to ride fire or water and race past an impressive animatronic dragon that would move, breathe fire, and splash its tail. The 2 coasters would climb modest 72-foot parallel lifts before each would turn around and take a straight drop side by side, rising through a double up and a turnaround before each would separate into their own playful layouts. Meeting up again for a second head-to-head turnaround and a side-by-side finale, the 2 would race along in a fun finale into the breaks. "2011 would see another 4 wooden coasters, including GCI's first in China with the simply named Wood Coaster, also known as Mountain Flyer, at Night Valley in Shenzhen. This would be a massive project for Great Coasters, by far their largest yet, with nearly 5,000 feet of track, and feature one of the most impressive terrain layouts ever, set along a mountainside and overlooking Mears Bay. Rolling to the right off the top of the 147-foot lift for a 270-degree panoramic turn, the coaster would take a small dip before turning down, never taking a super large drop, but dipping lower and lower down the valley, gaining more and more speed. After tearing through more twists down the mountain, the coaster would complete not one, but 2 station fly-throughs, a tunnel, and more quick hills in what was easily their most impressive coaster to date. This would be followed by the next 3 Gravity Group layouts, with the first being a tribute to a classic coaster with Zippin' Pippin at Wisconsin's Bay Beach. Modeled exactly after the John A. Miller coaster of the same name, which operated since 1923 at Libertyland in Memphis, the coaster was most famous for being the favorite of Elvis Presley. This faithful tribute would feature the same out-and-back layout, featuring flat turnarounds and hills, including a shockingly sharp one on the return run. The other 2, while by far the smallest of the year, were significant for taking the junior wooden concept to a new level. For years, Gravity Group had designed layouts, and either the parks themselves, or more often, Martin and Vlemix, would actually build them, with all running standard PTC trains. These 2 would be the first to be built by their new subsidiary, Gravity Craft Corporation, and also the first to run their own new train, which they dubbed the Timberliner. These would seat riders in a similar arrangement to Millennium Flyers, with individual rows capable of an even tighter turning radius, but with a far larger hydraulic lap bar that would come down from the side, securing riders for stronger forces while staying in a single position. These extreme forces wouldn't be found too much on these smaller rides though, but they would still pack a major punch, with the first being Wooden Warrior at Quasi Amusement Park in Connecticut. With stats even smaller than the common jet flyer layout found on rides like Woodstock Express at Kings Island, one wouldn't expect much from a Junior Woody, but the coaster would begin with a steep 48-degree drop, providing shocking airtime, followed by more hills with similar strong forces and dynamic banked turns. This really was like shrinking a major coaster into a perfect family-friendly package, and would also open on the similar Twister at Gronelund in Sweden, but in an even more impressive location. Built directly under and over 3 steel coasters in the park and along a waterfront, the coaster would creatively still find ways to pack in strong airtime moments while twisting around and through itself over and over. While those would be the 4 new coasters of the year, something else would happen in 2011 that would change the trajectory of wooden coasters forever. While demand and innovation clearly hadn't gone stale enough yet, the advancements steel coasters were making at the time were far more exciting to the general public, with brand new launches, inversions, and all at heights parks were not willing to go with wood. Enter Fred Grubb, founder of Rocky Mountain Construction in Idaho, who began work retracking wooden coasters, leading him to push innovation with more steel for longer-lasting, smoother coasters. Along with Alan Schilke from SNS, they would develop a new square steel I-beam track that would measure at the same dimensions of standard wooden track, which could be used on parts of wooden coasters or to completely redo them, as was the case for their first coaster this year. Texas Giant, the second longest coaster ever built by the Din Corporation, was getting rougher and rougher through the years, and the massive structure in the Arlington climate was beginning to become too costly to maintain for Six Flags Over Texas. They would look to RMC to take a gamble on this all-steel track makeover, and thus the new Texas Giant would be revealed to massive fanfare and success. While featuring 700 less feet of track, every other aspect of the coaster would be massively improved, with a taller, faster, and steeper drop, sharper turns, and copious amounts of airtime throughout, all over butter-smooth steel track. While this video is already long enough, this innovation by RMC is paramount to wooden coaster history, as over time the company would see massive success and even push other wooden companies to innovate with more steel tracks in the future. Rocky Mountain would go on to convert 13 other wooden coasters, including 5 which were less than 20 years old at their closure, from just about every manufacturer, with each pushing the limits even more, with more daring airtime and even inversions, and making rides such as Mean Streak, Rattler, and White Cyclone disappear from their current record-holding spots. Going back to standard wooden coasters, 2012 would see 2 more international additions, with GCI's being Wodan Timber Coaster at the world-renowned Europa Park. Only the second non-Mock Rides coaster in the family-owned park, this would stand as the company's tallest freestanding and fastest to date, and drop down the large 134-foot lift with a wraparound curving plunge. Twisting through a banking hill, the coaster would turn and drop through multiple tunnels and a station fly-through, before going out and over rides in the park before banking and curving back to the station. The other would be Gravity Group's next in China, and sadly, the last racing wooden coaster built, Dueling Dragon at Happy Valley, Wuhan. Built by Martin and Vlemix, who would handle the rest of Gravity Group's coasters in China. If this is the last racing wooden coaster built, at least it pulled out every trick in the book, with 2 dynamic layouts curving under and over each other through multiple flybys. A blue and red train would climb 2 parallel lifts, with blue curving under and red dropping straight next to it, followed by both meeting up for a first-of-its-kind element dubbed the High Five, banking both tracks near 90 degrees at each other, with the feeling that either train could reach out and touch the other's hand. After both trains would turn around for a head-to-head flyby, the trains would follow parallel through a couple hills before a fun maneuver where each would take turns wrapping around each other, before more side-to-side hills and a turn before 2 separate helixes and a final side-by-side hop into the brakes. "2013 would be the most significant year for Woodies in a while, with 5 coasters of all sizes, beginning with the next 2 from GCI in the US. Similar to what Gravity Group had done a couple years before, White Lightning would be Great Coaster's attempt at a family-scale ride as their smallest to date, and their first with a shorter 6-car train. Featuring a simple L-shaped out-and-back layout, the coaster would drop into a low turn, followed by the trademark GCI turns and hills, including a double-up, double-down hill. The larger would be Gold Striker at California's Great America, another moderately sized twister that would begin with the standard GCI twisting drop, but in a fully enclosed tunnel. After that would be an intense low-to-the-ground layout, packing in more tight twists as GCI would continue to evolve and push the limits of dynamic, tight, and smooth coasters with excellent pacing. Gravity Group's contribution of the year would be another in China, Fjord Flying Dragon at Happy Valley Tianjin, with a layout that almost calls back to the classic CCI coasters of the past, with a fast-paced double out and back layout, with sustained hills and less sharply banked turns. The final two of the year would be a massive shakeup of anything seen the last few years, with the first being a true passion project for Knoebels. The park, which prides itself on its nostalgic experience, as well as preserving and building classic rides such as their ground-up Woody Twister, would take on an ambitious 7-year labor of love to revive the wooden bobsled. Flying Turns, as the model was often referred to, only saw around a dozen installations, with the last opening nearly 100 years before, but these coasters were fondly remembered for their unique ride style, with the most significant being the largest at Euclid Beach. Knoebels wouldn't nearly be as big, but still had to be built completely from scratch, with the large wooden troughs and custom throwback trains. But thankfully, after all that time, the coaster paid off as a fantastic product. The small 3-car trains would navigate 3 lifts and drop into tight, quick direction-changing turns fluidly, providing a fun and hard-to-anticipate layout. On the complete opposite end of a throwback, Rocky Mountain Construction, who opened their second wood-to-steel conversion this year as well, would also open their first wooden coaster of their own, and maybe even more than Intamin's prefabricated coasters, this would push wooden coaster design even further into a new era. Similarly fabricated off-site, these rails would be mounted onto wooden boards, but the wheels would run entirely on a thick steel beam instead of a flat plate. And running on these rails would be a brand new train developed completely for Outlaw Run. This groundbreaking ride at Silver Dollar City would feature new 2-row 6-car trains with a heavy lap bar and shin guards, as this would be the first wooden coaster since Son of Beast to attempt to invert riders, 3 times in fact. Ironically, at the same time, Gravity Group would be working with Mount Olympus to redo their original ride with Timberliner trains, as well as adding a corkscrew to convert it to Hades 360. But this would be the first ground-up ride to attempt such a large feat. Climbing a modest 107-foot lift and turning to the left, the coaster would plunge into the wilderness down a 162-foot, 81-degree drop, hitting 68 miles per hour to make it the 3rd fastest and steepest Woody in the world. After that wild drop, the train would fly into the first inversion, rising to the left and then banking a severe 153 degrees to the right, dumping riders out to the side. The boundary-pushing Alan Schilke design would continue through 2 hills and a steep turn through the lift, which would twist out providing more airtime, and followed directly by a banked wave turn full of even more airtime roller coaster lovers had never felt before. After climbing up the hillside with a final hump, the coaster would enter the finale, a slow, upward, double heartline roll that would level off perfectly, losing speed at just the right time to enter the brakes. For their first ground-up coaster, RMC could not have made much more of a splash, packing in all kinds of intense sensations and proving they had the capability to fully build rides of their own, striking a new wave of competition through the wooden coaster world. The next year would kick off with Gravity Group's next family-sized coaster, this time Rorosaurus at Storyland, with the same track length as Wooden Warrior and a similar turnaround before another steep drop. The coaster would then have a double up and a tunnel, followed by another flurry of small hills that all packed a punch on adorable dinosaur trains. This would be followed with another in China, this time Gravity Group's first large-scale ground-up coaster with timberliners on time travel at Hot Go Park. Dropping straight under the midway and into a large turn that would dive down the terrain. After flying through turns and up into a large drop, the ride would go back down the hillside and up towards a highly banked turn, before furiously curving back under the pathway and finishing with another series of strong bunny hills before soaring into the brakes. The final of the year would be the next record breaker from RMC, Goliath at Six Flags Great America, standing with a super eye-catching, minimalistic, two-support steel structure lift hill that would make it the third tallest in the world. Off that lift, though, the ride would plunge 85 degrees underground, making it not only the steepest, but the largest drop of any wood coaster at 180 feet, and unsurprisingly reaching the fastest speed of 72 miles per hour. The train would then fly through a funky banking turnaround before dropping down the red rails over a hill and rising through two more inversions, with sensations new to not only wooden coasters, but coasters in general: hang time. The first would be an elongated dive loop, turning the train around and dropping down to ground level, before a first-of-its-kind element, a zero-G stall. The train would enter and exit similar to a zero-G roll, but with the twist between extremely extended to let riders embrace the upside-down weightlessness before snapping back upright and back into a tunnel. After a final wonky banked turnaround, the coaster would hop into the brakes, and while very short, the groundbreaking elements Goliath did have would again change roller coasters forever. "2015 would see 5 more coasters, all coming from the Gravity Group. This would begin with one of the most unconventional woodies yet, Switchback at the small ZDTs in Texas, standing 64 feet with short 4-car trains. With stats like these, this would at first seem like a slightly larger junior woody, but after a steep drop through straight track and a series of turns and hills, the train would rise up a vertical 87-degree spike, the only ever on a wooden coaster, and complete the layout in reverse. After dipping and twisting backwards past rides and through buildings, the train would stop on the brakes at the beginning straight track before a switch back into the station. The other 4 would all be overseas, and massive rides over 100 feet tall, with the first being Cuchulainn at Ireland's Tayto Park. This large double out and back would take a straight drop into a speed hill through a tunnel, before a circling layout with plenty of hops and turns, as well as another near 90-degree banked turn and a second tunnel before hopping into the brakes. This is where things get complicated, because next is the first 3 of 7 total Gravity Group coasters named Jungle Trailblazer in China. So let's begin with the first to open at Oriental Heritage in Jinan. It doesn't help that these all have near identical stats, but each for this year is custom with their own differences, with this one dropping straight into an airtime pop before a low rising turn, followed by another turn and the next corkscrew inversion to be found. After that, the coaster would stay super low to the ground through 4 powerful speed hills, before a steep turnaround and another series of larger hills and a turn into the brakes. The next would be at Fantawild Dreamland in Zhengzhou, turning off the top of the lift and featuring no inversion, but dropping straight into a short hill before a 90-degree wave-like turn. After a turnaround at a seemingly similar angle, the coaster would rise and complete another 90-degree hill in the opposite direction of the first. The coaster would then stay very low throughout, completing a double out and back layout with plenty of hills and laterals on an island setting in the middle of the park. The third would also be at an Oriental Heritage Park, this time in Wuhu, with another double out and back layout. This time, the coaster would drop into two large hills before an inversion, with the majority of the coaster featuring larger hills and turnarounds, but still keeping an incredible pace throughout. The next year would be another huge one for International Woodies, with the first being Gravity Group's next Junior Woody with Timber at Walibi Rhone Alps. This would be the tallest of the standard family coasters so far, but feature more turns than the others, as well as back-to-back banking hills. Along with this would be another two Jungle Trailblazers, with both being cloned layouts. The one at Oriental Heritage Ningbo would be the same one as the one at Oriental Heritage Jinan, and the one at Fantawild Dreamland would be a clone of Fjord Flying Dragon, with the latter having the distinction of being the last ride to open with PTC trains. After being the default rolling stock for hundreds of rides over decades, modern banking and turning radius demands would phase these trains out, but their legacy is still appreciated on all their classic rides today. After 2 years off, GCI would return this year with yet another coaster in China, and they would make it a good one with Python in Bamboo Forest at Nanchang Wanda Theme Park. This would be their tallest and longest coaster, marking the only time they've passed 5,000 feet, as well as their fastest at 62 miles per hour. Rolling out of the station through a twisting pre-lift past some bamboo, the snake-themed train would climb the 142-foot lift and drop banking down to the left before taking a double down and dropping further down the coaster's hillside setting. After a large turnaround, the coaster would follow a supersized out-and-back layout, working its way back through the lift structure, with each turnaround dropping the coaster further down the hillside before a relentlessly paced finale with a fury of quick hills and twists in a style reminiscent of Boulder Dash's setting. The final two of the year would be the next from RMC, but much like Intamin's prefabs, these would sadly already be their final two wooden coasters, with both models only producing 4 rides total. While pushing wooden coaster technology to its limits certainly produces some incredible rides, it comes at a cost, not only up front, but mainly in the long run with the maintenance, ironically. While these rides were sold on the idea of being easier to maintain due to their plug-and-play track, the higher concentration of forces leads to the more expensive to produce track harder to quickly fix, as well as more G's being exerted all across the structure with less parts readily available. The coasters themselves would still be more game changers, with the first being Wildfire at the Kolmarden Zoo in Sweden, tying T-Express for the tallest coaster in the world, and cracking the top 3 in speed. Built on a stunning cliffside setting, the coaster would take a 270 panoramic turnaround before a steep 83-degree drop directly into a 0G stall, before flying through a turnaround that would dump the train 90 degrees into an overbanked turn. The coaster would then make its way back to the station with a series of fast hills and highly banked turns, as well as 2 heartline rolls that would hug the ground and fly past the trees. The last of the year would be the furthest the limits of wooden coasters had been pushed since Son of Beast, as RMC attempted to use the biggest technology steel coasters have over wood and build the first launched wooden roller coaster. Lightning Rod at Dollywood would use an upwards LSM launch onto a large hillside, accelerating trains before a supersized pre-drop hill and a 165-foot drop, reaching the fastest 73 miles per hour. The train would then fly through a giant wave turn with sideways airtime, before rising through back-to-back Outer Banked hills at breakneck speeds, and setting up for a wild finale of a quadruple down the hillside next to the launch, gaining tons of speed on the way down. After soaring through a giant final turnaround with airtime, the coaster would return to the station on one of the best coasters ever, if only you were lucky enough to ride it. Unfortunately, this would be the single most problematic coaster built in years, with sporadic openings throughout 2016, leading to the launch being slowed the following year, and later more modifications leading to the removal of the launch entirely in 2024. After a smaller showing the last few years, GCI would explode back onto the scene with 5 new coasters of all sizes and locations, beginning with Heidi the Ride at Plopsaland de Pan. This would be a near exact clone of White Lightning, standing slightly larger but following the exact same path, with slightly more refined and less intense banking for the family-friendly park. Sticking with the smaller design, Invader at Busch Gardens Williamsburg would stand with near identical stats, rolling off a turning pre-drop before a steep drop through a tunnel. This would be an airtime and banking-filled terrain layout, diving over and under train tracks and down the hillside with a Viking theme. Going back to the park that put wooden coasters back on the map, Kings Island would contact GCI for an out-and-back layout, with Mystic Timbers featuring a near-identical, updated layout to Prowler, with better modern airtime and banking throughout at a slightly larger size. The final 2 would be more for China, with the first being Great Desert Rally at Happy Valley Chengdu, a compact double out and back wrapped around a B&M dive coaster. Beginning with a wraparound drop, this would have a layout with less small dips than the rest of GCI's modern coasters, but still flying through the layout with large elements and fast pacing. The other would be Jungle Dragon at Happy Valley Chongqing, another hillside layout and one of Great Coaster's largest, nearly 4,000 feet working down the hillside, beginning with a curving drop with a bit of a pre-lift before the plunge. This would go back and forth down the hillside with a series of large sustained hills, building up more speed with each dive down the hillside. The year would also see the next 2 Gravity Group coasters, with their next and most recent thrilling coaster in the US, Mindblower at Fun Spot Kissimmee. While nowhere near as large as their first few coasters, this compact double out and back would be somewhere between those and their family coasters, beginning with a super steep drop into another corkscrew inversion. The coaster would then cruise through a turnaround and a double down, before a series of low hills and a 115-degree overbank turn before rocketing back to the station. This year would conclude with another jungle trailblazer at Oriental Heritage Xiamen, and the last to feature an original layout. Turning off the lift into another steep drop, this would fly through a layout nearly devoid of standard turnarounds, instead rising through countless airtime hills with lateral turns between the valleys, as well as another near 90-degree banked hill as well. Gravity Group kept the production coming with 3 more coasters in 2018, beginning with 2 more family coasters, including the cutely themed Oscar's Wacky Taxi at Sesame Place. Turning around before the small but steep drop, this tiny out and back would pack in another flurry of airtime hills and a turn through a tunnel, with a unique green support structure for the titular Muppet. Standing larger would be Wood Express at Parc St. Paul in France, featuring a similar out and back layout but traveling over more sizable hills than the other family wooden coasters before it. Last from Gravity Group this year would be the final Jungle Trailblazer at Fantawild Asian Legend, featuring the same double out and back layout as the version at Fantawild Dreamland Zhengzhou, with the back-to-back 90-degree hills and low-to-the-ground layout. GCI would open another highly anticipated coaster this year, this time a strongly marketed secret weapon coaster at Alton Towers. Wicker Man would stand as one of the company's smallest coasters due to the height restrictions of the park, but make up for it with amazing theming, soaring through multiple flybys inside a giant statue of the Wicker Man himself. Beginning up a unique lift hill that would change angles, the coaster would take a small curving pre-drop before dipping into another tunnel and snaking down the twisted layout, running at a very low speed, but featuring 2 non-bank turns for good laterals. The coaster would also have the distinction of being the last design accredited to Jeff Pike, with GCI's layouts after coming from Skyline Designs, a subsidiary of an up-and-coming manufacturer that Jeff Pike now works for and still oversees designs for. Both Gravity Group and GCI would open family coasters in 2019, with the latter being Wilkolak at Magellan County in Poland, this time a mirror image of Heidi the Ride. Gravity Group would open Kentucky Flyer at Kentucky Kingdom, an out-and-back coaster full of airtime with an airplane-themed train. For the first time in 15 years, 2020 would only see one coaster open, this being Texas Stingray at SeaWorld San Antonio. Curving off the lift, this would be the company's first coaster with a totally straight drop, giving plenty of airtime before the twisted layout with high bank turns, before the classic low bumps and curves, including a drop through a tunnel. With many travel restrictions still facing the world, 2021 would only see one coaster open, with this being Gravity Group's Wooden Dragons at Jinan Sunak Land, and while featuring near identical smaller stats to a ride like Wicker Man, this would do so much more. This would drop right into a small hill and a large turn, before a low-to-the-ground layout with small hills and turns, including a 90-degree turn as well as multiple tunnels. As for the rest of this year, after the 2020 season and 4 years of maintenance nightmares, Dollywood would make the tough choice to convert over half of Lightning Rod's layout into standard RMC iBox track. While there is still plenty of wood on the course, many have deemed that this coaster has lost its wooden distinction, therefore losing its title as the fastest and 4th tallest. That leaves these as the top 5 in their respective categories to this day, leading myself and many others to wonder what park will ever challenge these and build a ride big enough to join this elite company. After some smaller years and smaller coasters, both manufacturers would come back in a big way, with 2 large international woodies. GCI would open Roaring Timbers at Exotica Village in the large resort complex of Sun World Hon Tom in Vietnam, and feature a similar hillside layout that would work its way down, much like Jungle Dragon, but with 1,000 less feet of track. This would begin with a similar wraparound drop to other GCI coasters, but with a fun bank at the end, before dropping and making its way down the hill with large turns and small hills. Gravity Group would open Leviathan at SeaWorld in Australia, and again while featuring similar stats, this would do so much more, dropping into an ultra-compact layout reminiscent of one of their first coasters in Boardwalk Bullet. Completing 3 laps around the dense structure, the coaster would also change directions on each pass, while still packing in multiple small hills and highly banked turns. "2023 would go back to one coaster, this time being an extremely unique coaster from GCI at Worlds of Fun. For their 50th anniversary, the park would pay tribute to their classic retired Schwarzkopf jumbo jet ride, Zambezi Zinger, but strangely, instead of contacting a steel coaster manufacturer, they would have GCI build a prototype ride with a new track and train style. As a response to RMC's popular iBox track, great coasters would unveil their own steel Titan track, and while it had been used on a handful of older coasters before this for retracking, this would be their first coaster to be built with it integrated into a small percentage of the layout. Along with that, this would be their first coaster in nearly 25 years to open with a new train, which they dubbed the Infinity Flyer, a far heavier train with hydraulic steel lap bars for moments of stronger forces, which contour much tighter on the rider's laps and below. The ride itself would begin with a completely unorthodox spiral tire lift, which, while paying tribute to the classic ride, would be totally impractical, but plunge riders down 75 feet into an equally unorthodox layout. While the park already had a GCI coaster in Prowler, this would be a smaller, twistier style layout, staying low to the ground with quick directional changes, along with a turn wrapping around the lift on steel Titan track. Being intended for families, this would also feature the same height requirement, and the heavier trains and more modern twisting would actually lead to this being a more intense and very strange coaster. Back to normalcy, Gravity Group would open their next family coaster, with Bobcat at Six Flags Great Escape, also featuring a new track innovation from their manufacturer. Like Intamin had started, and now RMC and GCI had done before them, they would develop a pre-cut track system, but sticking completely with wood, in a new method of vertically laid wooden members, for stronger and smoother track while retaining the true classic wooden feel. The coaster itself would show off this smoothness, with a more graceful and drawn-out layout than other family Gravity Group coasters before it, providing more sustained airtime while keeping the ride as fun as ever. After years of sitting, GCI's Spanish-themed Hala Madrid would open at Real Madrid World in Dubai. Originally set to open as Bombay Express when the park operated as Bollywood Park Dubai, this was intended to have the most airtime moments of any coaster in the world, and while that record may be true, many of these would be taken by tiny humps through the modestly sized layout. Taking another straight, non-GCI-like plunge, this double out and back would take that standard layout but add many RMC-inspired humps to nearly every hill and turnaround, leading to a strange layout that would cruise around at a modest speed. This takes us to near modern day, where 2025 saw 2 GCI coasters open, beginning with the family-sized Wild Buffalo at Mer de Sable in France, standing as their smallest yet, weaving through the compact twisting layout at a nice pace and 2 pass-throughs of a tunnel. The far larger would open on the last day of the year, with Colossus opening at Six Flags Qiddiya City as the company's second to open with the new Infinity Flyer trains. Rolling through a small pre-lift, this coaster would be devoid of the company's new Titan track and take another straight drop into one of their best paced layouts yet, following a super twisted double out and back with strong hills, as well as having a nice wave turn and a final drop into a tunnel. This year, only one wooden coaster is scheduled to open, this being the long-delayed Mad Racers at Fantasy Valley in Jiangyang, a coaster which had its footers poured all the way back in 2021, in a layout many predicted to be another clone of Thunderbird at Power Park. While it looks to be very similar, it seems to have slightly different stats and may be a more modern interpretation of the layout, if it ever opens. If this coaster doesn't open this year, 2026 will be the first in over 40 years to not see a new wooden coaster open, which would be a very sad record in the dwindling world of wooden coaster demand. Beyond that, we currently only know of 3 new wooden coasters coming all to international parks, with a new GCI coaster opening at Park Miraculum as the first wooden coaster in Czechia. The size and layout harkens back to a classic GCI coaster, beginning with an extended pre-lift into a tunnel before a twisting drop in another layout full of turnarounds and hills, as well as another tunnel before the brake run. Also in Europe, Italy will receive their second wooden coaster ever after Sierra Tonante from Gravity Group at Magicland, but much less details are known about this. Replacing the park's flying island, this will run along the front of the park by the road, but any other details of the size or scale are unknown. Recently announced is Watatsumi coming to Greenland in Japan, with a short height of 63 feet and a track length of only 2,036 feet, as another smaller out-and-back coaster from GCI with blue steel supports. And that's it. Around 55 years of wooden roller coaster history to the modern day. To me, all coaster innovation starts with wood, as the more nimble and variable track allows designers freedoms to experiment, and the evolution of banking and small hills has fully bled over into steel coasters. RMC changed coasters forever with their action-packed layouts full of extra dips and humps, leading to major steel coaster producers such as Intamin, Vekoma, and plenty others following suit, which all started with wood. I really hope the innovations RMC, GCI, and Gravity Group have all introduced over the last decade to increase longevity and reduce maintenance allows parks to be more inclined to buy more wooden coasters, as the demand is certainly winding down with almost all the best rides now going to international parks. And while parks seem to be loving GCI's Titan track for valleys of massive force on older coasters, I really appreciate Gravity Group's commitment to the soul of wooden coasters, and hopefully this strong pre-cut track convinces parks to take a risk and break some of these records that haven't been touched in a decade. Thanks again for another long-form roller coaster history video. This was by far my most ambitious yet, but it may have been the most fun to make, as the pure evolution of all these rides was incredible to witness. Thanks for watching and stay tuned for more, and be sure to check out the other 2 history videos of Intamin and Vekoma.